Hi Penny, this is the Mahar Kids, Esther, Ruth, Lee, and Philip, and today we'll be reading Acts 17 verses 22 through 31. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man.
Nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made for one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets even said, for we are indeed his offspring.
Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, this week I had 5 graveside services this week. It was a nice weather week to be standing in a lot of beautiful graveyards. I started the week with 2 people, daughter and son-in-law, and me, laying to rest the woman's 94-year-old mother. Twice, 2 of the services this week, we had one of the stillest moments in modern life. I'm convinced it's one of the stillest moments in modern life, where taps is played at the funeral of a veteran and the flag ceremony is carried out, and everyone stops. No phones are out. Everyone just stands. 2 funerals for veterans, both members of this church. Another funeral I went to, pulled up and immediately saw this one was going to be different than the others when I saw all the Harley Davidsons and leather jackets, and a whole family clan and a lot of babies on hips. And then this afternoon, the last one, just as the clouds were rolling in, whole group of people, maybe 60 people standing in a graveyard, just a little bit of rain and a lot of wind, saying goodbye to a dear friend. I wonder, this is a week in which I knew I was going to be preaching on final judgment, and then I was standing around in graveyards all week. I wonder if you have ever thought about your own funeral, or if you've ever wondered what people might say when they stand around your grave. As they're sharing memories, what are the stories they'll tell? What are the casual judgments they'll make? Who won't come? Who will? What won't be said in public, but will be said in private, where we're less afraid to speak honestly? Have you ever thought about it? There's no reason to believe from the Bible that we'll see it. I just don't know. We don't have that information that we'll be able to see what's happening back here. But then, according to the Bible, all the words said about us, all the summary statements that might be made about us. He was a good man, he was a hard father, she was a generous woman, she was bitter at the end. Whatever is said, anything that is said, anything that happens at the funeral won't matter to us at all. Because when we die, for the first time in our entire existence, we will suddenly be fully aware of the presence of God. And we will know only what he says about us matters. That's the final judgment. When people say, only God can judge me, I wonder if they understand what that means. The Creed says it will happen. We've been looking at the Apostles' Creed, which is this ancient statement of biblical truth, of what the Bible teaches. And the Creed, after saying that Jesus Christ is suffered under Pontius Pilate, is risen, and is now ascended to the right hand of God the Father in heaven, it says next these words, which is our topic for tonight. From there, in other words, from heaven, his place of ruling authority, from there he shall come to judge the living and the dead. Now, I have to acknowledge that the idea of final judgment is one that many of us are pretty disturbed by, and many people in our world today react strongly against. It sounds harsh and difficult. If gospel means good news, final judgment does not sound good. I heard Dr. Ben Adams, who's a theology professor, put it this way. You know, as you go through the creed, he says, he's speaking about the creed, you go through the creed, you see how it's good news. A God who is a father made everything out of his love. Wonderful. A God who is eternal and always exists is a father, not just a force. Very good. Jesus came among us, born among us as God in the flesh. Good news. He suffered, but he suffered for us. Good news. He rose. He's victorious. Good news. And he will judge. Oh. He said it's a little bit like some of those commercials you see on television where it says, here's the great product. It will make you sleep, or it will cause you to lose weight, or it will end your back pain. And then the small print starts scrolling and it says, has these side effects, right? Might cause constant sweating, heartburn, headache, swelling, and death. And you say, wait a minute. What's that? Is final judgment a wait a minute, what's that moment? Well, the first question is not whether it's good news, though that's an important question. The first question is whether it's true. And I have to tell you, it is the Bible's teaching. It is Jesus' teaching. Jesus insisted on it, and if you read through the Gospels, you will see him tell parables about final judgment and speak about it, not as parables, but as truth, both communicating this will happen. But it is also, I believe, good news. Psalm 96 that we read earlier celebrates it. The trees of the field clapping their hands because God comes to judge. How can this be good news? What does it mean? There's one sentence. This is the Mahar kids read a great sermon of Paul's. There is so much of interest in it. All I want to look with you tonight at is one sentence, one final sentence, the final sentence of Acts chapter 17. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof to this to everyone by raising him from the dead. One sentence, actually, not even that, I read two. One sentence I just want to look at, and we'll just look at the basic teaching of what the idea of final judgment means. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed, which tells us three things about final judgment. It is coming, it will be just, and it will be by Jesus. Very simply, those three things. It is coming, will be just, and it will be done by Jesus. Final judgment is coming. He says very clearly, God has appointed a day, he has set a day when he will judge the world. And that includes the world. That includes all of those living and dead, as the Creed says. Jesus makes that very clear in John chapter 5. You don't die and get out of judgment. Everyone, all human beings, will face judgment. I have been reading, not just standing in graveyards, but reading a lot of judgment texts, trying to figure out how do we talk about this teaching, which would be best to settle on for this week. And here's just a couple. There are many. Jesus says in Matthew 25, right at the start of Matthew 25, the parable at the end of Matthew 25, in verses 31 and 32, Jesus' words, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will sit on his throne. He will judge, Jesus says. Or Revelation 20, verses 11 to 13, this great vision John has of the end of time. John says, "Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence. There was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the death that were in them. And each person was judged according to what they had done." So to be clear, just two examples. To be clear, that Scripture teaches that judgment is coming. It's coming for you and for me. The day has already been appointed by God. And the teaching of Jesus when he spoke about this regularly was to challenge us. This is Jesus' main point, is to challenge us to be aware of this fact and to be ready to live in light of it. His regular teaching is not to be asleep to that reality, because you are headed toward it, inevitably, unstoppably. When I was in my last year of seminary on the North Shore of Boston, I went to a church in Boston. I worked in a ministry down in the city in Boston on Wednesday nights. And so one Wednesday night, I went down, and I don't know why I didn't drive, but a few times I would do this. I took the train, so I took the commuter rail into Boston. Served with the ministry I was working with there. And then I caught the commuter rail late at night. I think it was the last train out of the city, heading back north on the Rockport-Gloucester line. And I had a stop that I needed to get off on, but I was tired, and I fell asleep. And I woke up suddenly realizing the train was still going, but with that panicked feeling of, wait a minute, where are we? And I had slept through it. I had rolled right through the stop where my car was. I was now rolling on a train. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't get off. I was rolling toward the end of the line. Thankfully, I had a girlfriend who lived near the end of the line, and I was able to wake her up and get a ride home. But you know, there's a way, and I was thinking of that this week because there's a way we're in a situation like this in regard to final judgment. We are rolling toward it. There is no stopping it. There is no getting off. You will arrive there. He has appointed a day when you will stand before the Lord. And Jesus' regular teaching is for you and me to take that seriously, to not fall asleep. I don't know how to make that more real to us. Stanley Hauerwas, who is a theologian, he wrote about how differently people view death today than they did our Christian ancestors did in the past. He says a theologian. He says he asks people how they want to die. He was asking people, how do you want to die? And their answer that he regularly got is, we want to die quickly and painlessly in our sleep because we don't want to know we're dying. I just want to go to sleep one night and not wake up. And being a theologian who knew the history of the church, he knew that that was actually the greatest fear of Christians in the past. Did you know that? Christians in the past, our Christian ancestors, did not want to have a sudden and surprising death, because such a death might mean they would die unreconciled with their neighbors, with their church, or with their God. What they wanted was to be ready to die, not to slip softly through death. Better to see it coming and do the work you need to do with others and with God than to slip away suddenly and suddenly stand before God, not having done the work you need to do with Him. He says, today we fear death more than we fear judgment. Jesus said, don't be afraid of the one who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear the one who can destroy both. This is sobering, but Jesus says it, and he says it so that we might change the way we live. 1 Peter 1:17 says, since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. In other words, what it means to be awake is to know that if judgment is coming, everything you do matters wonderfully. It's important. It counts. And you will answer for it. So be reconciled now to those you need to be reconciled to. Deal with the areas in your life that need to be dealt with that are sinful now while you can deal with them. Make peace with God through Christ now while you can. Don't put it off. And do good. This is what Jesus says. Do good if you know that there will be judgment coming. You know, Jesus in the parable of the sheep and the goats, it's a difficult parable in Matthew 25. But Jesus tells us about the final judgment, and this is what he says. He says, at that final judgment, he will say to some, these are Jesus' words, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of these least brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." In other words, what Jesus is saying, it is not just what we should stop doing, but do you realize that the things that you do when you do them for Christ, even the least act of kindness and mercy, will be celebrated and greeted with thunderous applause in heaven? If this is true, how then should we live? For Christ, of course. His judgment is coming. And the good news is not only that final judgment is coming, but that the final judgment will be just. It says, in one verse, "For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice," or literally, the word there's Greek word is dikaiosune, easy for me to say, right? Righteousness or justice, by God's holy standard. The final judgment is coming, and the final judgment will be just. He will judge the world with justice. And this doctrine of final judgment with justice, by the way, has been embraced by many, many, many people in this world who have suffered great injustice and oppression. By saying that there is a judge who will judge the world with justice, this has been taken as good news by many. I mean, don't you hear it in Psalm 96? Psalm 96, they say, good, someone's finally going to deal with the injustice in this world. In other words, the judge who is coming, who will judge the world, will judge by the perfect standard, the high, holy standard of right and wrong, and he will judge without partiality, no favoritism. He won't be swayed by anyone's power or popularity. He will do justly by everyone, perfectly just, which is not the situation many times in this world. C.S. Lewis, writing about this passage, says, the reason why you see such celebration of judgment, particularly in the Old Testament, is because in most of this world, around the world and through most of the history of this world, the small man, the little guy, has had trouble getting justice. He's had trouble getting justice without a bribe, or without being able to have the right connections. So the idea that one day, perfect justice will come is good news to many people on this earth. That's not just in the past, that's now. You know, nothing is perfect in this world, including our national system of justice. But maybe we take for granted how much the law enforcement system in this country makes life possible here in many ways. In comparison, you only need to look around the rest of the world to see what happens when there is no justice, no just law enforcement system. A few years ago, Gary Haugen, who's a Christian, a lawyer, works with the Christian organization International Justice Mission, and Victor Boutros, who is a federal prosecutor and now works in a nonprofit fighting human trafficking. They wrote a book called The Locust Effect, Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence. What they said is that all the money in the last century, something like $3 trillion in a half century, was sent to poor parts of the world to try to develop and end poverty. And there was an assessment done saying, how is it that these $3 trillion haven't had a greater effect? Now, there's a lot of good news. They are having an effect, but not had a greater effect. And the reason, they said, is because in a lot of these countries, the law enforcement system is so corrupt that the poorest people who are trying to be helped, as soon as they get a little bit of ahead, there are forces and bullies, they call them, that swoop in, take advantage of them, push them down, take the money away, and there's nothing they can do. C.S. Lewis says, hundreds and thousands of people who have been stripped of all they possess and who have the right entirely on their side at the last judgment will be heard. They aren't afraid of judgment in that case because they know their case is unanswerable. If only it could be heard. When God comes to judge, at last it will. And this is part of the good news of judgment. It's not only coming, but it will be just. And people who've been denied justice will get it. And even now, that motivates us to work for what is right according to God's standards, without favoritism or prejudice, all people treated as worthy of great worth and value as those made in the image of God, and with a special concern for the vulnerable and those in the weak who are oppressed. We work as Christians in the light of final judgment for justice now, because the end is coming. And the end, that final justice, that final judgment will be just. But of course, the very promise of a final judgment that is just, according to the righteousness of God, according to this high standard, impartially implied, is also a reason for us to be concerned. If God's going to judge by the perfect standard of justice with no impartiality, no favoritism given, no grading on a curve, he will give us just exactly what we deserve. That means most of our favorite tools for dealing with our own guilty consciences will no longer apply on that day. We can't compare ourselves to others and say, well, at least I'm better than... Nope, not on that day. We can't minimize and say, well, but it's not as bad as... No, it will be according to his standard. And his standard is exact. Jesus said, Matthew 12, 36 and 37, I tell you that everyone will have to give an account on the day of judgment for every empty word they have spoken. For by your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you will be condemned. This is why Romans says on that day, every mouth will be shut. The justice will be so incomplete, we will have no defense. What judgment God gives will be right. Which is ultimately why it is such good news to know one more thing. Final judgment is coming. It will be just. And it will be by Jesus. Verse 31 says this, for a day, he set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. The judge on the last day will be Christ himself. Now, I was on a criminal jury once in Lowell, Massachusetts, and the foreman of the jury was randomly chosen, and it was me. It was an assault case. It was a relatively young man charged, a relatively younger girl who was the victim and who testified on the stand. It was a heavy week in court. But the evidence was pretty clear. So we as the jury talked for, I think, about an hour. And then everyone came back into the courtroom. And I don't know if you've ever been in that kind of a setting before, but it's a dramatic place. Everybody standing, the judge, the man accused standing there before us as we looked at him. And the judge said to me, foreman of the jury, what is your verdict? And I said, guilty. Now, on the last day, when we stand before the throne of God, who will speak the verdict over your life and mine? It won't be a randomly selected juror. The Bible says the teaching of the New Testament, over and over again, the teaching of Jesus, again, clear teaching again and again, is that it is Jesus who God will give the authority to judge the world, which he will do on the last day. That is what Paul says as well. He has appointed a man to judge the world with justice, and it's clear he's talking about Jesus in the next verse. He says he has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. Only one man's been raised from the dead. It's Jesus. He's the judge. And if we are all rapidly moving toward that day when with perfect justice we will hear the verdict on us, do not think that because Jesus is the judge, that means he's going to be soft on us. In this way, Jesus is perfectly good. He's no different than he was. This is not a different Jesus. He is fully God. He won't be soft or hard. He'll be just. He'll do what is right, as he always did. There's no darkness in him. He's full of truth. He is one with God the Father Almighty. He will judge by the high standard of his Father perfectly, without favoritism. But there is one more thing that we know about this last day. That last day, that judgment day, will be a day in which the brilliant holiness and perfect justice of God is magnificently displayed. And it will also be a day when the abounding mercy and the bottomless grace of God is gloriously revealed. You see, if you are going to be saved on that judgment day, it will not be because of your perfection. It will not be because you're a little better than everyone else. How would you even know? What standard are you judging by? And if you're going to be saved on that last day, it won't be because you're perfect, and it also won't be because God suspends the laws of righteousness and justice. He won't go soft. Creation cries for justice. God is going to bring it. This is part of the good news. He must put an end to all that is wrong and has hurt his world. No, if you are going to be saved on the last day, it won't be because of your perfection, and it won't be because of God's compromise. If you're going to be saved on that last day, it will be because of the just mercy of Jesus Christ. If you put your trust in him and in his death for your sin, then you already know now that the judge is your Savior and that his verdict is in. His verdict is, there is therefore right now no condemnation for you. And the reason you can know that, and the reason why this is both just and merciful, is because the judge himself has satisfied every demand of justice on your behalf and in your place if you trust in him. He's not suspended justice saying there's no punishment. Rather, he has taken what justice demands in your place. And because of that, it is God's justice that will set you free on the last day. You can't be punished for what has already been poured out on Christ. There's no double jeopardy. He paid it all. Therefore, it would be unjust to hold you accountable for it. In his mercy, he took your place. And if you trust him, you already know what he will say because he says it now. You are forgiven. There is no condemnation. And you are clothed with the very righteousness of Christ. Which, by the way, if this is the mercy with which God has treated us, how merciful should we be in our treatments and rapid judgments of others? God has so dealt with us. And so we look to that last day. There is a day of final judgment. It is coming. It will be perfectly just. But that judge will be Jesus himself. And if you are in him, the verdict is in. So until that last day, we should live then, Christians should live as people who know there will be a final judgment, which I think means this. that we live as if every day, every action, every act of justice, every act of holiness, every act of mercy, every cup of water given, Jesus says, matters. It won't be forgotten on the last day. And we should live as those who work for holiness and our own lives and justice in this world, as those convinced that there will come a day when Jesus will make things right. And we should live as people whose actions and work and judgments and lives flow out with abundant mercy toward others. Because if you know the judgment you deserve and the mercy you've received, how can you not be merciful to others? Jesus Christ will come and make all things right. God is not dead. He does not sleep. The wrong will fail. The right prevail. The judgment of Jesus Christ.